affairs. Interdisciplinary research. The task before us in today's webinar is to examine trends in methane regulation with respect to the oil and gas industry. Given recent activity by the US EPA, the Bureau of Land Management, the US Senate, and several states regarding the regulation of methane emissions from domestic oil and gas sector activity, we will discuss the implication of these trends in Appalachia and nationwide. Our discussion today incorporates research activities from the Ohio Shale Innovation Project, which is using an interdisciplinary approach to study the economic, environmental, engineering, and policy trade-offs that drive resource extraction. This collaboration between the College of Arts and Sciences, the Russ College of Engineering and Technology, and the Voinovich School aims to develop a deeper understanding of how to help build a more robust and resilient regional economy. During today's webinar, you can submit questions for our panelists at any time during the session using the question field on the GoToWebinar navigation pane. Following the presentations, we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible during our time today. As always, a recording of this webinar and a downloadable version of our presenters' slide decks will be available at ohio.edu/CE3 by week's end. This information will also be emailed to participants. If you enjoy this webinar, I invite you to mark your calendars for our next session on the topic of severance taxes, which will be held on Wednesday, December 6th from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. A formal announcement on that webinar will be released soon. With that, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our attendees on the line, and especially to our panel of experts for sharing their time and perspectives with us today. To start, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Michael J. Zimmer. Mr. Zimmer, an expert in energy law and policy, is an executive in residence at both the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs and the Russ College of Engineering and Technology at Ohio University. Mr. Zimmer, please take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome to our audience this afternoon, and a special welcome to our panelists and distinguished guests. The topic today has been chosen with much reflection by the school and the various groups with which we have been working over the past year on shale development. Methane leakage from oil and gas operations has emerged as the second largest industrial contributor to climate change in the United States. Along with methane, various industry operations, other toxic chemicals appear into the air, increasing the risk of public health issues and problems. Other chemicals from oil and gas development and gas operations contribute to high levels of ozone smog, starting to appear more readily now, even in large rural areas like Wyoming, Utah, Texas, and also in Alberta, Canada. These dangerous pollutants are a particular threat to the more than 12 million Americans who live within a half mile of oil and gas operations, and almost 4.6 million of those citizens live in Ohio and Pennsylvania alone that are exposed to these issues and their thoughtful consideration. Voluntary industry efforts have been undertaken over the past 20 years, particularly under the EPA Natural Gas STAR program, with a variety of results from those voluntary efforts. And finally, jobs, economics, and the recognition of future benefits to the states and regions regarding addressing and management of methane pollution is starting to appear in the discussions more recently. And the values of standardization, best management practices, and economics will drive better outcomes for methane regulation ahead. We've had a lot of activity in this space over the past 2 years in the waning year of the Obama administration, and some of the more focused activities undertaken by the Trump administration to change the public policy review of these issues. That has opened up a wide opportunity for the states and regions to weigh in with their thoughtful consideration of these issues. We are privileged to have three panelists who will bring a multitude of perspectives to our webinar today. Our first speaker will be Robert Hodenbosey, PE, the Chief of the Division of Air Pollution Control at the Ohio EPA. Mr. Hodenbosey has served as the Division Chief in 1992 and is currently responsible for the Air Pollution Control Program for the state of Ohio and the development of programs needed to comply with the Clean Air Act amendments. He has testified before the U.S. House and Senate committees on Clean Air Act implications and issues affecting industries and facilities in the state of Ohio. He has served in a number of capacities at the agency on air quality monitoring, planning, and permitting, and he received his MS degree in chemical engineering at Cleveland State University. It's been a privilege and my opportunity to welcome Bob back to an Ohio University program where he has spoken previously in the past and has shared important presentations with our audiences on energy and environmental issues affecting the state and the region. Our second speaker will be Melanie Houston, the Director of Climate Programs for the Ohio Environmental Council. Melanie is responsible for establishing and managing a variety of policy initiatives at the Environmental Council, and she is an expert on oil and gas policy. She has briefed congressional and state lawmakers in the past on issues related to air, land, and water from oil and gas development. She's advised the White House Council on environmental quality and has testified on these questions and issues before committees of the Ohio General Assembly. She's appeared and presented views in a number of TV, radio, and media outlets, and she has earned her MS degree from the Ohio State University. Our final presenter will be Dr. Benjamin Schlesinger, the founding president of Benjamin Schlesinger and Associates. I've had the privilege of knowing and working with Ben for 40 years now in a variety of capacities. We started jointly serving in the 70s at the American Gas Association. Ben has had nearly 4 decades of experience in managing and carrying out engineering economic analyses of complex energy issues. He's focused on gas commodities, contracting, pricing, and he's advised clients in the U.S., Canada, and almost 30 other countries. He's a former vice president at the American Gas Association, a member of the New York Mercantile Exchange. He's also their Natural Gas Advisory Committee, and he has provided expert testimony on oil and gas and industry issues before the U.S. Congress and in 18 states, as well as the province of Ontario. He's currently teaching at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and he has received his MS and PhD degrees from Stanford University in industrial engineering. We're privileged to have our speakers in their variety of experiences, and our first speaker, Robert Hodenbosey, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak this afternoon. It's always good to get together on these webinars that Ohio University holds. What I'd like to do this afternoon is summarize what Ohio EPA is doing as far as regulating the natural gas industry in Ohio and how it's developed over the past few years. Next. I'll hit a summary of some of the regulations that apply to the industry and some of the related air quality issues that are coming from it, plus maybe some other items that are coming to the forefront with this industry overall. Next. This is a diagram that illustrates the natural gas processing system, and somewhat the complexity of the system itself, all the way from the producing wells to the residential and commercial customers. It certainly is complex, and there's been a lot of development in eastern Ohio getting those natural gas wells that are producing to the ultimate consumer, and there's been a lot of infrastructure that has been installed in eastern Ohio. Next. The first beginning is the natural gas well sites. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources has the real lead on the natural gas well sites. For any entity that wants to produce wells in Ohio, they need to get a permit from ODNR. They have specific reporting requirements that they have to give ODNR, and ODNR goes out and inspects those facilities for compliance. US EPA also has rules that are applicable to the drilling of the wells, the engines that are at the well sites, and some permitting requirements. Also, US EPA has requirements on flow back on the liquids that are coming back from the fractured wells. Next. We have permits when for these production wells, and along with US EPA. One of the things that we have tried to do is, when this all started, we saw that there was going to be a great deal of activity and a large number of permits that were going to be needed to be issued. And overall, our permit system looks at it as a case by case, and we thought that this was not going to be successful, that we would literally be overrun with permits. So what we did is we set up a general permit that is a public notice that incorporates what we think is best available technology and incorporates US EPA standards, and we public notice that, and then facilities can look at that general permit and say, yep, I can comply with those requirements in that general permit, and therefore we go forward and have a permit issued in a relatively short amount of time. Next. Once we have the wells and the fracturing going on, there are some large diesel engines that are at the site. There are roads for construction that need to be handled for fugitive dust. There are portable storage tanks. There's sometimes some temporary flares in case there's a large gas release. And most of this is taken care of by ODNR. There are engines on site that are regulated by US EPA, the portable engines that have to go on at location. Next. Once the fluid is pumped down and returned, then those have to go into storage tanks, and those fluids themselves are regulated by ODNR and US EPA, and there are specific requirements about how that fluid is disposed of in Ohio. Next. At the site during the fracturing, there are large diesel engines that are pumping down the fluid. These are the fluids are coming back. There are temporary storage tanks there. There's all kind of different support equipment on site. If things go smoothly, it's possible to get a well drilled in 2 or 3 days, and there are multiple wells at each site. And again, the engines are regulated by US EPA that are on site. They're temporarily there. This is a photo of one of the sites and you could see how crowded it is. I think this is an example of one that is, I'll say, overly packed with equipment. Usually there's more space than this on site, but at times they can be very complex interaction going on with all of these pieces of equipment, trying to make sure that they are safely doing the fracturing of the wells. Next. Going to the production phase, once the wells are drilled, then typically there is some gas conditioning equipment that's on site, and depending on the actual well site, there are some liquid storage tanks and control equipment for the natural gas liquids that are coming from the wells. One of the things that has occurred in Ohio is that many of our wells produce natural gas liquids that are quite valuable for the industry. So we have wet gas coming from Ohio, and that requires then folks to have storage tanks, to have controls on those storage tanks, and to make sure that when those liquids are being transferred to trucks, that they are being done safely. One of the things that we did is with our general permit is we allowed some flexibility in that as the gas flow changes, there's folks might have to have different engines put in, and we allow that equipment to be swapped out as part of the general permit. Next. And this is, again, a diagram that is there for your information that shows the processes that are going on at one of the gas well sites that are also producing the natural gas liquids. Next. Part of the production, there could be dehydration units and at the site that are removing water, and this can be a source of emissions that we have to take a look at when our folks are doing inspections on site. There's natural gas fired engines that are there and potentially diesel fired engines, but the natural gas is there and they tend to mostly use natural gas for the compressors at the well sites. Next. We have, as part of our general permit, we allow for the water and the natural gas liquids to be stored on site. We also include requirements for a combustor or a flare, and we also have requirements on some of the ancillary equipment for the pumps, pipings, and particularly looking at equipment leaks, plus requirements on the unpaved roadways. Next. One of the things that the discussion today has been on methane, but our focus is more on some of the more, I'll say, traditional pollutants that can impact both air toxics for neighbors nearby, plus the overall impact on ozone downwind. So we look at some of these more traditional pollutants with concern from the potential emissions from these sources. Next. Our general permit approach was to allow for the drilling, and those are generally exempt, but the production is covered by the general permit to cover the well sites, and it's for an entire site, not in an individual well, and there could be 6 wells, maybe sometimes up to 8 wells at a location. Next. One of the things that our general permit did is it allowed for the changing of engines without having to get a new permit. We allow for various tank sizes that are necessary to allow some flexibility, and it has a requirement for leak detection and repair program at these facilities. Next is just a listing of the rules that could apply at these locations, and there are US EPA requirements for air toxics. There's new source performance standards that apply, plus there are Ohio EPA regulations that apply. Next. The compressor stations, from the well sites, it goes to compressor stations, and we also developed general permits for compressor stations in order for these facilities to be permitted and to have uniform standards throughout the state. These are bigger sources of air pollution than the actual well sites, and they have significant engines on location in order to compress the gas from the well sites. They do a little bit of cleanup, and then they send it on to the next processing plant. Next. There are also potential for storage tanks of natural gas liquids. There can be some dehydration units. There's typically flares. And one of the things that we look at are also fugitive emissions from equipment leaks from these compressor stations. Next. Now, from the compressor stations, it continues on to what we describe as midstream processing facilities. And there's some smaller ones that are separation plants that take the natural gas from the compressor sites and separate those out from the liquids from the natural gas, and either send it on to the pipelines or send it on to some fractionation facilities. And these midstream plants, just like the compressor sites, they have multiple sources of emissions that that need to be regulated and permitted. Next. Next, please. Thank you. One of the facilities that types of facilities we have in the state are fractionation facilities, and these are handling the natural gas liquids that we're getting from the wells, and it splits them out into ethane, propane, butane, and other components, and those are sold to various companies to make products from all kind of petroleum products and to use as feedstocks in some chemical plants. At these fractionation facilities, there are a variety of heaters, flares, tanks, and the potential for equipment leaks. Next. Now, we only have a few of these fractionation facilities in the state. They are large facilities, large installations, and they have a number of compressors. They have fractionation towers. There's numerous tanks, pressurized tanks. There are roadways. Some have rail loading to handle the natural gas liquids. And throughout the facility, there is the potential for equipment leaks. Now, these larger facilities, because of their nature, because of the size, and because of the actual complexity of their installation, we go away from the general permit, and we have these require a case-by-case analysis to make sure that they are in compliance with the numerous US EPA and state requirements for air pollution sources. Next. Lastly, there's my email address. If you have any questions, you can send it on. And at this point, I will turn it back to Michael.
Thank you, Bob, for sharing your insights from your experience here in Ohio. The audience is reminded that you had the opportunity to raise questions, which will be reserved for the discussion and question part of the program, and use your site for that purpose as we proceed. Our next speaker is going to be Melanie, and Melanie, the floor is now yours.
All right, thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, and I want to thank Ohio University for this opportunity to talk about the problem of methane pollution in Ohio and how we tackle it. And thanks to all the participants for taking your lunch hour to join us here today. My name is Melanie Houston, and I'm the Director of Climate Programs for the OEC. And just to share a little bit about me, I actually grew up in a rural community in Ohio, in central Ohio. And as a kid, I went mushroom hunting and would play in the pond at the end of our gravel road with my brothers. We raised chickens, we had a large garden. And I really became interested in working on environmental issues, I think, with having that connection to the land, and also was really influenced by my grandfather, who was a biology teacher, and my grandmother was a nurse, and spent a lot of time with them growing up. So I really enjoy working at the intersection of public health and the environment. And now that I have my own daughter, who's in the picture here, she's 4 years old, she provides daily inspiration for me as I work to secure cleaner and healthier air here in Ohio. So go ahead to the next slide, please. So we get to the next slide here. I want to talk a little about the OEC. We are a statewide environmental advocacy organization, and our mission is to secure healthy air, land, and water for all who call Ohio home. And we really do much of our work to secure a healthier environment by influencing policy and regulations at the state and national level. We also have a law center as well, and we do some work at the federal level. I'm sorry, I just said that, at the national level as well. And so that's really what we're talking about today. We do much of our work at the state level, but a small portion of our work, and more really today, deals with federal level standards. So let's go to the next slide. At the OEC, I just want to make mention that our position is not to oppose oil and gas development or fracking, but we do believe that the industry has a responsibility to be good neighbors, and we embrace recent efforts to rein in methane and other air pollutants. So in the summer of 2015, we began leading Ohio's efforts on a national campaign with the goal of securing these common sense methane standards that would reduce the amount of leaking methane from natural gas infrastructure. And these standards, one is with the EPA, the US EPA, and one is with the Bureau of Land Management. They will require companies to reduce waste through affordable, cost-effective technologies, and make sense really from both an economic and public health perspective. And go ahead, next slide, please. So I know we have a variety of probably different technical expertise levels in terms of participants on the phone. I'm going to take a step back just for a moment to give the basics on what methane is. It's an organic compound that's the primary component of natural gas. And it's emitted into the atmosphere from various sources, including decaying landfills, agriculture, and what we're talking about here today, which is oil and gas development. And it's worth noting that recently oil and gas has become the leading source of methane pollution, really surpassing agriculture. And so what does this problem look like here in Ohio, this problem of methane leaks? In 2015, Ohio's oil and gas operators reported wasting more than 25,000 metric tons. And to put that into perspective, that's enough natural gas to heat over 15,000 Ohio homes. And we also like to note that this is most likely an underestimate because only the large oil and gas operators are required to report these emissions. Next slide. And so why does this matter? This is important because methane pollution is a major problem for the health of Ohioans. And this is, while methane itself can contribute to what's called ground level smog or ozone pollution, this is also because methane pollution, as I think Chief Bob Hodenbosey noted, methane pollution also, when it escapes from the oil and gas sector, it comes with these other kind of harmful air pollutants, sometimes referred to as hitchhiker air pollutants. So things like the volatile organic compounds, benzene, formaldehyde, other kind of air pollutants. And these items are known to, these harmful air pollutants are known to trigger things like asthma attacks, to aggravate respiratory conditions, and can even in some circumstances increase the risk of developing cancer. Also, methane pollution is about 80 times as potent of a climate driver pollutant than carbon in the short term. And we know that there are a host of public health problems related to climate change, things like an increase in vector-borne diseases, more severe storms, and flooding. Let's go to the next slide. And Ohioans are really at risk. So in Ohio, because we are a densely populated state, we have more residents who live within a half-mile, what we call as a threat zone of oil and gas development than any other state. We have approximately 3.2 million people who live within a half-mile of an oil and gas facility of some type. This could be a well pad, a compressor station, many other different types of facilities. And there are about 780,000 students within a half-mile of an oil and gas facility and schools, and nearly 30,000 cases of childhood asthma attacks that can be connected or attributed to oil and gas ozone pollution each year. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what the cost is to industry to implement these standards. It has been estimated by the experts that look at the numbers that the cost to implement these standards is about 1 penny per 1,000 cubic square feet. And we really have it's a pretty small investment there, and we have evidence as well, sort of on the ground facts that indicate that these standards will not be harmful to industry as they do make that upfront investment to implement them. The first piece of evidence is that Colorado actually passed their own state-level methane standards, which were really a model for the federal government, for the US EPA's methane standards. And even with those going into place and with low gas prices, both factors at play, oil and gas development has continued forward in that state. And as the chief of the Air Pollution Division of Air Pollution Control, Bob, noted earlier that the Ohio EPA, has taken some really positive steps through permitting to address this methane pollution and other harmful air pollutants. And this also has not stalled or slowed down the industry really in any way in Ohio. But despite these facts, our federal methane standards are currently under attack, and that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit next. So go ahead and advance to the next slide. I'm going to start with the Bureau of Land Management methane standard or rule, which limits releases of methane and associated air pollution from oil and gas facilities, specifically in national forests and on other public lands. And so this new standard would reduce waste and save American taxpayers money. Oops, just a moment. And this standard was finalized in 2017, but it was threatened by Congress through a tool called the Congressional Review Act this past spring. While our coalition helped to defeat this Congressional Review Act attack back in the spring, just this month, unfortunately, the Bureau of Land Management proposed to stay or put a hold on their methane standard for 18 months. And what we'll be seeing next is essentially that this rule stay will be fought in the courts, you know, by a number of different stakeholders, including environmental organizations. And, you know, what I want to say about why this rule is so important is that there's enough taxpayer-owned natural gas being wasted annually on America's public lands to supply a city the size of Chicago for a year. And if this standard goes away, taxpayers would be losing out on about $800 million in royalties over a decade because of the venting and flaring of natural gas alone on public lands. And specifically for Ohio, and we have our only national forest, the Wayne, which would be affected by this standard, and without it, and with potential for more oil and gas development to happen on that national forest, we'll see more pollution for the visitors, you know, to the Wayne National Forest without these protections. Let's go ahead and go forward to the next slide. I want to talk about the US EPA methane standards now, and these apply, whereas BLM really dealt with public lands, the US EPA methane standards deal with oil and gas operators on private lands and specifically deal with new and modified oil and gas facilities. So these first set of EPA standards don't deal with the existing infrastructure, just new and modified. So these standards would require operators to monitor and fix leaks from the moment of drilling to right before the natural gas is distributed to the consumer. These standards were finalized in June of 2016, but unfortunately, again, we have seen another federal agency here, the US EPA, recently announcing that they intend to delay these standards for up to 2 years. And so the OEC, with other advocates, like labor groups, faith groups, and affected citizens, we testified in opposition to the stay of these standards this past July in Washington, D.C. And we're currently waiting to see how the agency responds to the public comments that they've received and the testimony. And litigation is also underway on this rule delay. Let's go forward to the next slide. So I want to share here just a little bit more about, you know, we've talked about the problem with methane pollution in Ohio, you know, the extent of the leaks, some of the specific health problems that can arise, how many Ohioans are exposed, and where each of the standards are in terms of with which agency, what they apply to, and you know, their status. And now I want to speak a little bit more in this last slide here about our advocacy efforts and really what we've been doing in the past 2 years in Ohio to support these standards. And so again, at the OEC, I hinted at this before, but we've really used our kind of organizing toolkit that we have here to build a broad-based coalition in Ohio. And this has been voices like labor unions, farmers with the Ohio Farmers Union, nurses, public health organizations, some local elected leaders as well, and affected citizens. And we've been activating all of these different stakeholders to educate our senators and our Congress people from Ohio about the benefits of these standards. We've also mobilized citizens to testify at the US EPA hearing. The first hearing that they had when they proposed these standards was back in 2015 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we had, I think, a crew of about nearly 30 people from Ohio going there to testify in support of those standards. And then again, this past summer in July, traveling to Washington, D.C. with several stakeholders and an affected citizen to testify in opposition to then delaying the US EPA standard. We've collected nearly 80,000 comments from Ohioans in support of the EPA standards and then submitted those to the US EPA. And we had 5,000 Ohioans join us for a town hall meeting to discuss specifically the Bureau of Land Management standards and methane pollution on public lands this past spring when the Congressional Review Act threat was imminent. And thankfully, again, that did not pass, but then the agency came back and did delay the standard. So, and then another big piece of this work that I think is important and something that folks could take a look at if you're interested in hearing from citizens in Ohio, we've been gathering stories of folks who really are experiencing some of the effects of this oil and gas air pollution, to their own health, to the health of their family members. And we've been doing this over the past 2 years. And you can find those by going to the Ohio Environmental Council's YouTube channel, is where we have those documented. So go ahead and advance to the last slide, which has my contact information. I really appreciate your attention, again, your time today. Thanks to Ohio University, and want to just welcome folks to get involved in this work or other work that the OEC is doing to advance clean water, clean air in Ohio, our public lands. And you can reach out to me, or you can find and follow the OEC on Facebook or Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melanie, for sharing your perspective and some of the factual information and data that you've developed both here in Ohio and nationwide. I'm pleased to introduce our final speaker today, who is Dr. Ben Schlesinger. And Ben, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. And, I want to echo everyone's thanks to Ohio University's Voinovich Center and the other groups within Ohio University for pulling together this very important discussion. And also thank my fellow speakers for laying out a real discussion of the magnitude and importance of addressing this issue. And so there may be a little overlap with my talk, and especially Bob's showing the gas chain. But just to, before I begin, just to, let's see, this is not actually advancing. There we go. So I just want to, I guess my talk is going to be focused on the reality of the natural gas role within the energy system in the United States and actually globally. And if anything, I guess this will underscore the importance of addressing the problem in a way that will prevent, methane emissions from expanding, develop technology that can be shared globally. All this is highly important because this fuel is increasing its role in the world. So just my own background, I'm not affiliated with the industry at all. I'm an independent consultant. We have, focused on natural gas for a number of years, decades and decades. Mike gave away the number of years, so I won't repeat that. But we've had a lot of work with respect to natural gas uses on behalf of clients and the power industry, traders, some within the gas industry, pipelines and utilities, but also auditing banks, governments, and universities. That gives you a sense of our client base and reach. And our work is really focused on the economics of the industry and understanding its industrial role. So, excuse me, just getting over a cold. Don't breathe into the microphone. So shale gas, yeah, it's now well over 60% of U.S. production. And it's really undercutting because it's so low cost. Other E&P, this chart shows the rise of shale gas. At the same time, we've got a decline in conventional production, labeled here as other gas. Now, to be fair, some of the Permian and some other resources are not actually shales, but they're in the chart marked this way. In particular, this area is the largest. It's the big daddy of all of the producing areas now, not just the shale areas. It, of course, accounts for about a quarter of U.S. gas. And just to put it in perspective, Appalachian, which includes Marcellus and Utica, and principally in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, compares pretty favorably to some of the world's largest gas fields. Shown here, we're comparing it with expectations for Russia's Yamal region, which is expected to feed Europe its gas supplies. So as though they don't have shales, and this is where they expect to get their production from. They have shales, they may develop them, they may not. Production in Yamal is expected by Russia to reach about 35 BCF a day by 2030 across 32 fields. The largest of these, about 2/3, is the Voinovich field, and its potential is about 21 BCF a day, according to Gazprom, its developer. By contrast, the Marcellus, Utica, and I guess Devonian as well, so called Appalachian, production is already 23 BCF a day and moving up. This is the actual as of this month, according to EIA. And this exceeds, all of this exceeds Qatar, which I mentioned because it's the largest exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, in the world. So the estimated recoverable in trillions of cubic feet, would stand up to the largest gas fields in the world. It's not the largest field in the world, but it's darn close. And unlike the Arctic or the Middle East, this is in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. So it's an unbelievable saga, but the intensity shifts. Right now, 40% of all the rigs in the United States are oil rigs, or rigs looking for oil in the Permian Basin. This has become a real focus because the cost of transportation from Appalachia down to the Gulf Coast, which is a major center of gas demand, is rising as new pipelines are necessary. So in response, there's a lot of drilling near the Gulf, on and near the Gulf Coast. And yet, production growth is centered right here. Almost half of the gas supply growth in the United States is taking place in the Marcellus and Utica basins. So, for this industry, the issue facing the industry is demand, as opposed to supply in economic terms. What are we doing to create demand? Well, Bob mentioned, a wealth of natural gas liquids coming off gas wells, and these are inspiring, 250 new chemical, petrochemical, steel, and other manufacturing plants, which are spread around mainly the producing region. A good deal of them are being developed in, in this region, and with an enormous investment. And also exporting LNG. I think everybody knows we've got almost more than 9 BCF a day of LNG exports in facilities that have been approved and are under construction or are now complete and exporting. There's another 6 or more BCF a day approved facilities waiting final investment decisions. By contrast, the total U.S. market is in the 80s BCF a day. So now people are talking about a second wave of LNG exports, and that could get as high as 12 BCF a day. I think that's a little far in the future. It's going to really depend on prices and resources and other LNG markets, which are starting to compete with the United States. The major use of gas is of course, coal replacement in terms of new markets. This cuts carbon emissions, and that's great. Melanie, cautions us that methane emissions can eliminate the global warming advantage, the greenhouse gas advantage of this. But barring that, gas and coal prices, what's going on is that gas prices are still higher than coal, but they're not that much higher, and they tend to be a little more volatile. And so even though gas is a little more costly on a unit basis, the fact is the coal fleet is terribly aging and inefficient. And this is a study that we did, and these plants are just in coal country, basically Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, and Ontario. We look at these plants, some of them are older than I am. It's unbelievable how it's kind of an unfair comparison, like a brand new sports car versus a pickup truck, an old 30-year pickup truck. The gas is being put through new power plants that are highly efficient, in some cases twice as efficient as the coal plants. So even though it's a little more expensive, it's cheaper to operate. And sure enough, gas is now picked off coal as the largest fuel used for power generation in the United States. I don't think anybody expects that to reverse in the near future. And this is the economics and the technical efficiencies that's driving this. Of course, renewables are increasing as well. So the net sum of all this is that CO2 in power generation, is falling, and that's fine. It happens it's not falling in the vehicle market, and so the net total production of CO2 in the United States from energy is still falling, but not quite as radically as shown here, because there's a lot of emissions of CO2 from vehicles that use gasoline and diesel. So, this is the promise, and to make this a reality, we can't kind of undermine it with methane. Another market is, basically matching the variations in renewable energy production. Hourly wind production in Texas is shown here. This is just over a month, and it's pretty typical. It just bounces terribly. And so the ways to control this make up for it. Hold on a second. I'm going to just have to shut this off. I apologize. So, using liquefied natural gas is actually easier than pipelines. Pipelines have to be nominated on a daily basis. It's a little hard to match, vagaries of wind production. And we've seen how much more easy it is to actually use gas in its liquid form, cold liquid form, because then that's a liquid and it can be put right into the power plants. What's going on in Spain and the United States have got 104 LNG storage plants. These are generally used for peaking for gas utility customers in the middle of the winter, but of course they could also be used to match renewables. And of course vehicles, I won't spend too much time on this. I'm personally a real fan of it. The question is why we're not 20 million of them in the United States if gas is so cheap, which it is. And in many areas it's moving. Large minibus, all the municipal buses in Los Angeles now run on natural gas without exception. Westport Cummins, it's got an LNG semi that'll travel 800 miles on natural gas in liquid form. And, the manufacturer's really not pushing this in small vehicles. Chrysler showed a beautiful new Charger that would be a natural gas vehicle using the new flat tank system, so you could go 300 miles and still have a large trunk. But in fact, the manufacturers are rushing to produce electric vehicles. The question of electric vehicles is pretty interesting. With gas growing as a power gen fuel, and gas is on the margin, throughout much of our power generation region that we're in, which is called the PJM region. It's also true in a number of other places. In fact, the electric car is, in a way, just a very highly efficient natural gas car, but the power is coming through the electric chain. And there I am parked right next to a pipe storage field in Wheeling, West Virginia. That pipe was later, put in the ground to carry natural gas to power plants to use for electric generation, for all electric markets, not just vehicles. So, I feel kind of strongly that this is actually an appropriate use of gas. So I won't belabor the gas chain, just simply to say that moving beyond, the production and, in gathering and processing fractionation, we really need to focus on other areas. Well, I think Melanie, touched on this. There's a good deal of leakage in the gas utility systems that simply must be controlled. Many of the gas distribution utilities are also older than I am. Many of them are 120, 150 years old, still bearing names like Gaslight. There's no question these facilities have got to be tightened for their own good. And again, as Melanie pointed out, when you do this, even at today's fairly low prices for natural gas, there's a windfall. You capture the methane instead of letting it escape. You can sell it. I think the liquefied natural gas chain has also got to be, that's got to be run in a really tight way. This is where gas is frozen into a liquid, transported on ships, and then regasified to markets that would otherwise not be able to get a hold of gas. And so that's an area where we've really got to make sure we're running tight. I'm referring here to the Environmental Defense Fund, University of Texas studies that shows that some of the overflight numbers with respect to methane leakage tended to be overstated, but then the studies that EDF and UT have done have focused in on actual numbers, and they're trying to work with producers to control this. Obama administration's green completions, and Melanie mentioned that. I personally feel these will survive the current EPA challenges precisely because of groups like Ohio Environmental Council and others who will succeed, I think, in making sure, ensuring that EPA does its job. And of course, another concern of many people is that there are other non-methane issues, although I think some of these have been resolved. The kind of mystery meat that was going into fracking sites is now pretty public. We're seeing a lot of recycling of return waters in Appalachia. Range and other producers are doing this, saves them having to buy water. It's particularly important in the Southwest arid regions. So in summary, this problem's not going to go away. We're going to have gas around for a long time. In this country, it's going to stay at low prices for at least another couple of decades because of the enormous resource, in particular where we're at now in Appalachia. Coal replacement will continue the process of replacing coal with natural gas, and that's fine from the CO2 emissions perspective. There's just, two things. We've got to make sure methane emissions don't, override that advantage, A, and B, we're pretty soon we'll run out of old coal-fired power plants to replace. We'll export LNG and start replacing them in India and China, and that's fine, but it's not going to happen here for that much longer. Newly created, actually, well, a number of examples of plants that can't be replaced, that coal plants will continue to go on. We'll see newly created, demands, pipeline exports actually are probably going to outpace our LNG exports. Enormous amount of export to Mexico. They're busy replacing oil-fired power gen with natural gas, primarily gas produced in the U.S. And so just basically, again, I'm optimistic that people like Melanie's group will succeed. The industry needs to do this for its own good. It can't really decarbonize. Natural gas is a carbon fuel, and so instead, I think the methane capture is economical. And boy, I left out my slide with my coordinates. I'll go ahead and send it to you, Mike, so that people have that as well. So thank you. That kind of concludes my my thoughts on the industry and what we need to do. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Ben, and to each one of our speakers, thank you for your shared views and perspectives, each of which are unique, different, and complementary, yet supplementary to each other as well. We're going to move to the question and discussion part of the program. We have several questions that have come in during the course of our formal presentations the past hour. Again, the audience is invited to pose their questions through the resource tools on our webinar. And let me start with the first question to Bob. And Bob, in your experience, in your role, are the states talking and working with each other in the region? And are they just operating in isolation, particularly as the lead is shifted from the federal arena, while we've seen in this current year either freezing or a delay in implementation of those federal activities, as Melanie has noted in her presentation. What are you seeing in terms of collaboration, communication with other states in the region?
Thank you, Michael. Ohio, we're working with West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Michigan. There's a small, I'll call it coalition of states that meet regularly to trade information, to provide updates as to how each of the states are regulating these industries, so that we understand what other states are doing, and that we try to the extent possible, coordinate our activities. An example is for some of our compressor general permits, the engines, we use liberally Pennsylvania's standards in developing those. We've also had communication with Colorado and what's going on out there as far as leak detection in the development of some of our standards for general permits. So yes, we are coordinating with other states in the region, and sometimes with some outside the region if there's some activity that we think can be helpful to us in terms of how we are developing our permits for the industry in Ohio.
Thank you, Bob. Melanie, in your formal remarks, you mentioned that 25,000 metric tons of methane was released in Ohio based upon 2015 data. By way of clarification, is that just in operations associated with production of natural gas, or does that figure include transmission, storage, and distribution of natural gas within the state?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, and perhaps Bob can weigh in on this too. My sense is that it is the latter, the comprehensive, and not just production. But I would have to go back and check that figure to be certain. I believe it is coming from reporting to the US EPA through some of their reporting programs that are required. But I don't have the specifics in front of me and can't remember for certain right now. So I have to go back and check.
Bob, do you want to supplement or comment on that discussion or point?
We lose Bob?
Bob, or I wanted to just check, is Bob still with us?
Yep. I'm sorry. I'm not able to elaborate on what Melanie said, maybe except for a little bit of a tangent. All of the discussion today was specifically about regulating emissions from various sources. Separate from all this activity, US EPA has set up a reporting system for various industries for greenhouse gases that include oil and gas, and that would be the source that we'd need to check to see exactly where the figure was derived from. But I have not heard of any activity about changing the reporting requirements, so I think those are going to stay in place on into the future for the industry.
Let me ask the next question of Ben. Then at this point, Ben, some people are advancing the views that what we're doing here in the U.S. is pretty important with our leadership in shale and shale development as other countries start to pursue their own shale resources. And they're going to be looking to U.S. standards and the U.S. outcomes and best practices to frame their own development activities. You want to comment on that issue or trend in terms of the U.S. activities and its relevance and importance ultimately to international shale development as well?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, it is not happening as fast as all that. Most drilling is taking place in the United States, some in Canada. Argentina's got a program that involves a lot of U.S. technology, and we're seeing the UK, begin a program. But for the most part, they're not moving. The rest of the world is not moving all that quickly on shale resources, and it's not from the lack of trying. China's spent considerable resources, but their resource is different, and they're going to require their own technologies. The success rate is not good in other places that have been done. The Russians are only beginning to look at this. And a large part of the problem is that, it's good for the United States, not good for the others, that the oil and gas industry in the United States is so highly developed, including here in Appalachia. The oil and gas industry is so well developed that the data is excellent. There are excellent numbers, there's excellent information, there's an excellent infrastructure. I can't understate how important the data infrastructure is. The probability of dry holes very low in the United States, very high elsewhere, because our data is so good, and that lowers costs. If it takes $6 to drill a well, and $3 to drill a well, and and you've got a 50% hit rate, well, then you got to drill twice as many wells, and it's really $6 per successful well. But if the opposite extreme, if you have full information, your $3 well really is a $3 well, $3 gas. So unfortunately, it's really not taking place as fast and as you would think it would. And so, yeah, I think our leadership's important, but it's going to be a little bit more long range. Finally, countries in Asia where gas growth in gas markets is enormous, will begin to develop their resources. So we've got time for them, but for us, we're seeing enormous growth, and we need to, in the United States, tighten this up. Thanks,
thank you, Ben. Melanie, we have a question. Does the OEC have any suggestions for the use of diesel by the equipment that's used to support unconventional gas and oil well development? Particularly, are there any better practices, or from your review and experience on use of diesel on equipment at well pads that you might share with the audience?
That's a good question. I have not built as much of an expertise around the diesel emissions. I'm a little bit less well-versed in that. I might deflect that one to Bob, actually, but I did want to follow up on the first question that you had asked, Mike, because I looked back at my fact sheet and the citation for the 25,000 metric tons figure, and so that actually was, I misspoke earlier, so that looks like it's the emissions are allocated to based on the percentage of production, and so the data reflects emissions only from upstream oil and gas production. So I can bring clarification at that point, but I'd like to defer my time to Bob if he would like to respond to the diesel equipment, which I know that they've got a more keen eye toward that.
Yeah, let me ask Bob the diesel question, and thank you for that clarification, Melanie. What have you seen in terms of diesel equipment or operations, better practices, or what have you picked up as your group has gone back in on audit or compliance review of what works better or better practices that people might be considering?
Well, I think part of the difficulty with the diesel engines are associated with the initial well drilling, because there isn't another source of fuel available to fuel the equipment that's on site. So once the well is up and operating, and the compressor stations and these midstream, those are all fueled with natural gas because the natural gas is there, and frankly, it's less expensive than diesel. It's just a practical reality that there isn't really an alternative fuel that's practically available on site to start the process going. But once production is in place, then that diesel equipment will be going away.
So with the passage of time, there may be less and less reliance upon diesel equipment, is your feeling?
Well, it's more short term than long term as far as the well drilling.
Okay. See the distinction. Ben, the next question that comes up, and others may want to comment on this. You know, we're reviewing these regulations at the federal level. The states are looking at their own interests in this question as well, and perhaps regionally too. Could the methane emissions be covered by a generalized cap and trade type of program or approach that might include carbon and methane together? What is the practicality or viability of that alternative? And of course, we have a program in place, the implementation AB 32 for greenhouse gas emissions in California. We have RGGI working, as we know, in the upper Northeast. And is that a viable alternative as we look at and go through this self-assessment of the regulations that have been wrought over the past 2 years under the Obama administration?
That's right, Mike. This works. Emission trading definitely works. It's been honed in under the Clean Air Act for the other criteria, contaminants. Especially those in urban areas in Los Angeles. There's an active trade in several of the contaminants, and we've been involved in that on behalf of clients. And RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that you mentioned in the Northeast, has so far been successful in in establishing a process. I think the standards have kind of been a little too high as this gas replacement of coal has been going on in our region. People are happily meeting their standards without the need to trade a great deal, because each gas plant replacing a coal plant reduces carbon dioxide. But the idea of moving to a trade in methane, of course, makes sense, and it would work as long as the program is designed in a way that succeeds. It's tough to do. It's challenged, not impossible, but it's challenging. A region can wind up migrating its industry, from one region to another. Migrating emissions, it's got to be designed with care. Can I just say one thing back to the 25,000 tons, Melanie? I was wondering about that too, and it is an upstream number, and it's only a portion of the methane emissions in the gas chain. I'm very concerned that gas utilities tighten up, especially, as I mentioned, the older ones. I read that there was a survey of our own gas distribution system in, I guess, one in Washington, D.C., that in which 6,000 small natural gas leaks were detected, greater or lesser. And of course, that's distribution company gas, which means you can smell it. These are coming from a variety of, meters that are not operating well, valves that are not operating well. So there's no question that gas utilities have got to tighten up. It's costly. And of course, they don't actually sell gas, they simply ship it. So saving gas, the benefits of saving the gas doesn't necessarily directly accrue to the company that's got to spend the money, unlike what takes place in the field. A producer tightens up, gets to keep the gas and sell it. some more of a direct incentive. So it's an issue. The actual number for particularly, the actual number is higher than 25,000 tons because of leakage downstream in the gas chain, as we've been discussing it.
Well, and there needs to be probably, when you get to the transmission distribution side of the ledger, Ben, that's accounted for in rates. Rate design, I guess, is lost in unaccounted for gas, and the incentives may need to be altered to achieve a better focus at the transmission and distribution level.
Completely agree. The LNU is just an add-on to the rate, so people just pay for it. There's no, I don't know if any system could be perfect, but these issues there should be a system set up so that they're minimized. Of course, many pipelines are beginning to use electric compression, so in effect that just moves the problem somewhere else to a power plant, which may in fact be an improvement.
Let me go to Bob, the next question. Bob, some of the aspects of gas operations that you broke down for us very nicely in your presentation, did mention flaring. Do the Utica and Marcellus regions and what you've seen in Ohio have as much flaring occurring as we've seen, particularly in the Bakken shale region? Is this more of a concern west of the Mississippi, or is this something that we need to be focusing on as well east of the Mississippi in Ohio? And Melanie, you may want to comment as well after Bob speaks.
Okay, again, thank you, Michael. From my understanding of what was going on in the Bakken fields was that the primary product was oil, and the natural gas was essentially a waste product that was just being flared, that they didn't have an infrastructure to handle that natural gas. From the very beginning, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources was very clear that they would not allow that type of activity in Ohio, that their requirements would not permit what we would describe just as a waste of those resources. So we wouldn't permit that type of activity in Ohio, but again, the activity here is just a little different in that it's natural gas, but we also have the liquids that sort of come as a bonus. It's not that the natural gas liquids are the primary product that people are getting to. So I don't think we're going to see that in Ohio. And frankly, our Department of Natural Resources said that they would not allow that.
Melanie, any comments you want to add on that point?
I don't think so. That sounds like Bob hit the nail on the head there.
Very good. We have a question from the audience. Ben, you may want to start. Others can chime in. There have been a lot of experience, particularly on oil and gas and major finds in Alaska. Going back to the 70s. Are Alaska's policies ones that could be adopted or reviewed or looked at by Ohio and other states? If the states are going to shift and be taking leadership, is this an area of better practices in whole or part? And if so, what might that be? Or are there other better alternatives that we should be looking at?
It's a really good question. Yeah, there was a time when Alaska was really our Siberia, I guess. This was where our gas was going to come from. I don't know if you realize, there's right now 4 times as much gas being produced out of the Marcellus and Utica as would ever be carried by an Alaska pipeline. So I think, just keeping the balance of the resource, this field, the Appalachian field, is much larger than Alaska, double the resources and 4 times the production today of the first Alaska pipe that the first Alaska pipe was going to carry. So Alaska people are pretty dejected. I haven't been there in a while, but I understand that there's kind of a malaise, if I may, that's set in. I don't know that they've developed any insights into methane capture that would be helpful to us. The nature of the resource, of course, is different. It's in a highly cold region, primarily associated gas as opposed to non-associated gas. So there's some significant differences. Don't know if that's the place to turn to. We're just going to have to figure this out for ourselves. People like Bob and Melanie.
Well, let me the follow-up, Ben. If I had a new find in Western Maryland and there were no moratorium in place, and I were the chief of regulation coming in from Maryland, what states would you point me to as states that have a good grip on this issue or have shown some better management practices in looking at this question if I had a big find in Western Maryland and I wanted to save time and get on with it?
I'd tell them to call Bob. I'd tell them to call people in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And possibly Texas.
A good place to start, and right in our home ground and region, why we're here together today.
Mike, can I? Oh,
go ahead, Melanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I heard that question correctly. Are we did I hear the word fine, F-I-N-E? That we're talking about potential fines on the industry for, if there are penalties.
Oh, no, Melanie, F-I-N-D. We had a major new find of resource in Western Maryland, and I had to get my permitting regulation in place. What states would I be looking to that have shown some leadership, better management practices that strike the right balance?
I gotcha. Okay. I misheard. Thank you.
Bob, any comment?
No. Except thank you, Ben. But as I mentioned before, we do look to other states and what they are doing, Colorado, Pennsylvania, in the development of our requirements for our industry. We want to make sure that the standards that we set are readily achievable, but from the very beginning, our charge has been we want to make sure that public health is protected. We have to make sure that our standards are adequate so that we don't have adverse impact on nearby residents, and that's something an overall challenge for our agency, the nature of the emissions. We do get complaints about some of these facilities, and we do send out our inspectors, and some of this is the practical reality. By the time that our inspector gets to the location, they aren't seeing or experiencing the same things that the complainant has experienced. So we're looking at other opportunities or ways to try to find maybe during these times when we can't get there, some ways of monitoring the emissions from the facilities. At one point, we had a monitoring station by one of the well sites, and we had it there for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and we did not detect anything of any significance at one of the well sites. And we are now looking at moving downstream and setting up a monitoring station at one of the larger producing fractionation facilities to monitor emissions to see if we can determine if there's significant impact on a community that is associated with some of these larger processing plants.
Bob, two quick questions, unrelated, but I think on your watch. Thank you for that answer. Please discuss the safety of fracturing on site. One of our participants in the audience has said Ohio EPA has responsibility to oversee safety. Is there an Ohio EPA inspector on site at all times? Question mark.
No, and the lead on the actual well drilling is the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Our agency does respond when there is a release, when there is an accident. We do have an emergency response division that will respond to any kind of environmental spill. But as far as the actual operations go, the drilling, that is ODNR's primary responsibility.
Thank you for that clarification. Finally, Bob, before we go back with all our speakers, what are the parameters of regulation, particularly regarding engines at the well extraction site? If engines may be changed following the first permit approvals, how is engine regulation administered in that kind of change environment? If it changes and it has an outcome, that's just picked up in the next audit and enforcement review?
Well, the engines overall, those tend to be regulated by US EPA. The manufacturer of the portable engines that are out in the United States are done on by the federal government because of the practicality of different states trying to regulate. These portable engines would lead to just a very difficult regulatory scheme for anybody to try to comply with various state requirements. For the most part, those are federal regulations that are applied to the engines, and our staff would be looking to ensure that they are complying with the federal requirements.
Very good. Thank you for that explanation. Final question for each of our speakers today. I'm going to ask the speakers to step back and give us their final thoughts, a minute each, on their forecast for methane regulations in the next year and the next 5 years. We're in a current environment this year that the regimes that have been put in place, advanced by BLM and EPA, are being frozen. What are going to be the state efforts or industry efforts to supplement, or will they accept that freeze, or will regulation of methane go away? Each speaker's thoughts on that and intuition would be useful. I'll start, Ben, with you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. It's a really great question. As I mentioned, I'm pretty optimistic that moves to keep federal EPA on track, doing its job, and likewise BLM will succeed in continuing methane regulation, and we won't have these long pauses, or if we do, there'll be short pauses. And I'm equally optimistic, for people at the state level. And that's what I would say. I just one clarification. I mentioned global gas. It's really global gas demand. People want more gas. They're not going to be producing, to the extent they would like the gas to have. And so I think we're going to have a smaller group of producing countries that we need to work with and make sure we share our technology with. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Well, you've also given us an important takeaway. A lot of the data on releases has been at the upstream level, whether it's accurate or inaccurate, deeper or longer. But your important point, Ben, is that their transmission, their distribution, operational leakages in our utilities to better understand. There's gas storage, and of course, you also highlighted LNG facilities are important sinks to focus upon as well in terms of methane releases going forward.
Yeah, and your point, Mike, about trading methane emissions makes a lot of sense. This has proved to be, once you've got a standard, then you can work within the standard, to optimize, costs in a way that helps everyone meet the standard more economically.
Thank you. Melanie, your final thoughts on that question. The state of methane regulation a year from now and 5 years, and what's the role of companies in the states here if at the federal level we continue the freeze that's in effect or being advanced?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. This is a really good question. I think for the federal standards, what we're trying to do here now the next 3 years is to really, hold ground on those. So I think we do that through continuing to, mobilize public support and put pressure on our elected officials, and particularly at the level of Congress, because these are federal standards, and also through the litigation. To essentially to fight through legal means the stay of standards which have already been finalized, have already gone through the public input process, and been well supported by Americans and Ohioans. I think in regard to the state level work, we're really proud of the work that Ohio EPA has done to make progress on the methane releases and the VOCs through permitting, and we'd like to offer our support to see how much further we can take that at the state level. Maybe there's a possibility for state level rules like Colorado has put into place, and we'd like to be a part of that conversation. And then finally, one piece that was hinted upon earlier, Bob mentioned, but which I didn't touch upon, is just there is a real need for more air monitoring data, both at the state level, which I know that there's a resource capacity issue there in terms of air monitoring, but for the universities and academics to step into this role as well, because we're really lacking, particularly around compressor stations, where there can be high variability in terms of when, the pollution may be high at certain moments and then very low at other moments. There needs to be some continuous, research and air monitoring data that's really gathered to understand why residents are experiencing some of these health impacts.
Great additions to the discussion, Melanie. Pennsylvania, of course, is zeroed in on compressor stations as well, I believe, in February of this year. And that may be a program to study or look at more thoroughly as well.
Yes.
Bob, you have the final response on the question. Thank you for your leadership working with your colleagues at Ohio EPA to put together the type of program and the balance you're trying to seek here in Ohio. Your thoughts on the next year and 5 years from now, the role of companies, the role of the states.
Again, I guess I want to thank Ohio University for overall setting up this discussion. I think it was very good. I'm not going to try to make a prediction on what's going on the federal level because it's going to be tied up in court, and it's really difficult to say where the court cases are going to end up. From our perspective, from the beginning, we have not had any kind of dictate that we have to be exactly like the federal government in terms of regulating oil and gas. The mandate was you need to have standards that are protective of public health. And as time went on, I think we were ahead of the federal government. The federal government came out with some additional rules that maybe jumped over where we were at, and then we adopt those. And then we take a look at where we're at, and if we need to tighten up ours some more, we see some areas that may not be covered, then we go ahead and propose some changes on our level. I think in some cases, the latest round of the new source performance standard from US EPA, they were looking at what we were doing and what Colorado was doing in leak detection when they came up with their program. So I do not see that we are going to modify our program that we have in place. People are able to comply with our requirements. People are able to get permits in a short amount of time. Overall, we're looking at trying to make sure that the public health is protected while the industry goes forward.
Thank you, Bob. And let me extend my gratitude to each of our speakers today. They have given us the gift of their time and insights over the past hour and a half to share with us in this Ohio University program. On behalf of Ohio University, the Russ College of Engineering, the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs, and our Vice President of Research, Joseph Shields, I want to thank our audience for your interest and attendance. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Jonathan Norris and Alyssa Welsh, who engaged in the structuring and development of the program that we've shared today. We look forward to continuing our discussions with you. We're in the second year of this 3-year grant. Our next program is on the topic of severance taxes to be conducted 12 noon on December 6th. Information will be shared with you on that shortly, chaired by Dr. Daniel Carney of the Economics Department here at Ohio University. Thank you for your engagement and participation, and everybody have a good rest of the week and weekend.